Okay, we carry on. I'm hoping to get through verses 2 to 16 today, so it's been a journey. I told you that there are a lot of things to talk about, and if you think I'm just going off, if you dig around in the air, you'll see, oh, now I know why the guy was talking about that. But these are things I think need to be touched on. Anyway, let me catch us back up where we were. As Paul indicates in chapter 11, verse 13, the specific issue he's addressing in verses 2 through 16 is whether it's proper that a woman pray to God, meaning pray in public, in the assembly, without the head covering. That in Greek, Roman, and Jewish culture of the first century was an expected piece of female attire. And his answer to that is no. And he explains in verses 4 through 6 that just as it would be disgraceful for a man to speak in public with that female covering on his head, so it would be disgraceful for a woman to speak without it. It would be disgraceful because it would be appearing as a man, just as having a shaved head or having very short hair in that culture was disgraceful for a woman because it was appearing as a man. In verses 7 to 10, he elaborates on why the covering in question, that culturally assigned female head covering, why it should be worn by the woman and should not be worn by the man. And referring to Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 to 23, he says that the woman is the glory of man. Now, meaning in addition to being the glory of God. So he says that she's the glory of man because she, Eve, was created from the man, from Adam, and was created to be the man's helper. So her existence redounds to the glory of the man. Man, on the other hand, is the glory of God alone, meaning he is not also the glory of woman. He was not created out of the woman, nor was he created to be the woman's helper. So her existence is she is the glory of man, and man is the glory of God in that distinctive sense. And this difference in objects of glorification, that she's the glory of man, he's the glory of God, this difference in objects of glorification, it has implications for who is a suitable candidate for wearing the female covering, because the female covering functions as a sign of authority, meaning it symbolizes that the wearer is under the authority of another. And though the woman is under the leadership of man, Paul says here that the female covering, that sign of authority, the reason he says it's fitting on the woman is because she is the glory of man, and man remains under the authority of God, however glorious he may be. So that's why he says here, see, that sign of authority is fitting on her because she's the glory of man, but that covering is not fitting on man because he's the glory of God. And there is no authority over God. So being under a sign of authority would not be proper on the man. Now that's where we ended last week. And at the end of verse, when I got out, Meg says, you didn't talk about the angels. It's coming. Okay. But when you hear at the end of verse 10, he gives yet another reason that a woman should have a sign of authority on her head, meaning the culturally assigned female covering. And that reason is that she should do so is on account of the angels. Okay, as Champ and Rossner say in their commentary, he says, for this reason, Paul could mean either the reasons just offered in the previous verses or the reason given at the end of the verse because of the angels. The fact that Paul has clearly been providing reasons why a woman should have her head covered in the previous verses suggests that that is what he has in mind. The sentence structure itself reveals that the reason is because of the angels. It's probably best to understand Paul to have both in mind. In fact, given the fact that the significance of the angels is unclear, an interpretation that relates the reference to the angels to the preceding arguments should probably be preferred, and I think that's right. The best way to understand this, in my judgment, is to recognize that angels observe Christian worship assemblies. That angels observe the worship assembly, and they're concerned that the worshipers properly observe the fact that God created mankind as two distinct sexes, and that He did so in a way that woman is the glory of man, in addition to God, that woman is the glory of man and man is the glory of God. So the angels are concerned that that be recognized and observed properly in the assemblies. Champ and Rossner, they say Paul may well be referring to the angels as divinely appointed auditors of the community's worship. And I think it's cool. When I envision that, I said that they're here observing. You see, divinely appointed auditors of the community's worship who, like God, would be offended by any shameful displays during the worship. So anything that would conflict with the truth that God created mankind as male and female, and He did it in a way that the woman is the glory of man and man is the glory of God, would be offensive. And so that's why he brings that up. So you both have those reasons, and on account of the angels, because the angels care that those reasons and those things are observed. So you get both. And I think that's the way to see it. Larry Hurtado, in his book, At the Origins of Christian Worship, he says Christians experienced their assemblies as not merely human events. This is talking about the early church. They experience their assemblies as not merely human events, but as having a transcendent dimension. And that's why, when people talk about, do I have to go to church? You're just missing what we're doing. You see, you're missing the glory in what is going on when the redeemed of God gather together to praise Him. You see, this is serious, but he says they sensed God as directly and really present in their meetings through His Spirit. In 1 Corinthians 11:10, the curious passing reference to the angels present in the worship assembly shows how familiar the idea was. Paul's Corinthian readers apparently needed no further explanation, though we could wish for one. As the holy ones, saints of God, believers saw their worship gatherings as attended by heavenly holy ones, angels, whose presence signified the heavenly significance of their humble house church assemblies. Okay? Don't think they always met in houses, but still, you get the idea. Verses 11 and 12, he says, nevertheless, neither is woman apart from man, nor man apart from woman in the Lord. For just as the woman is from the man, so also the man is by the woman, and all things are from God. So verses 11 and 12, they make clear that these sex differences about which he's been speaking, and which must continue to be honored in dress, in attire, which is what he's addressing. They're not a matter of superiority or inferiority. That is not what's being talked about. There's simply differences in role and function. And so he wants to make that clear. Men and women in Christ are mutually dependent on each other. They're mutually dependent on each other, and in each needing the other, so we can be we can be the mankind that God wants us to be. Okay, so we have this mutual dependence in verse 11, and then evidence of that mutual dependence is that whereas womankind initially came from Adam, she's created from Adam, all subsequent men have come from woman. Right? So we have womankind being created from Adam, but all of the other men are birthed by women, despite what our society tells you. They're all birthed by women. You see, so that's what he's talking about there. And so all of them have come from, and then he says all things come from one God. Here's what Schreiner says, Thomas Schreiner, in his commentary. He says, Paul wants to avoid any thought that women are ontologically inferior by nature, intrinsically. Different roles, but that doesn't mean, as I talked about with the Trinity, particularly with Jesus and the Father. Different roles, but there's no ontological inferiority. And so he says ontologically inferior. Thus he emphasizes the interdependence of men and women in the Lord. Women came into existence through men, but men come into the world through women. The first woman was from the first man, but now all men come into the world through women, that is, through their birth mother. A difference in function between men and women does not negate the equality and value of the two sexes. I say that, I mean that, and we need to understand that. Okay? Differing roles do not mean I'm all that. Okay? You see here, it doesn't negate that, and I hope that's something that you understand. Now, regarding this final clause where he says, all things are from God, Schreiner, in his commentary, he says, in saying everything comes from God, the Lord is acknowledged as the ultimate source of life and all that is good. At the same time, there is the recognition that the diversity and unity of the sexes come from Him. He has sovereignly appointed, directed, and blessed both sexes. All things are from Him. You see, all things are from Him. So this is what Paul is talking about. And then he gets down into 13 and 16, where he says, judge among yourselves. Now, you know I put a lot of weight on this, because I see Paul is now boiling it down to what's the issue in controversy. And he says, judge among yourselves, is it proper that a woman pray to God uncovered? That was the issue that had happened. That was what was brought to Paul. That's the question. He says, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman wears long hair, it is a glory to her. For long hair has been given to her as a covering. But if anyone is disposed to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. So Paul here, he appeals to what they already recognized. They already recognized about long hair to make his point that women should not pray uncovered as some were doing, or at least arguing for the right to do. Remember, so you have some women who are praying and they say, listen, we want to do so as men. We want to do so by removing this distinctively female piece of attire. And so he's using this now as an analogy to further his argument there. When he says nature itself, you see, nature itself taught them that long hair was a dishonor to men, but a glory to women. You say, well, how does nature teach them that? It teaches them that in that the distinction of mankind into two sexes, that is a fundamental and basic aspect of the creation order. From jump, when God created mankind, He made them male and female. It is fundamental, and as I said last week or 2 weeks ago, that is why that concept is so under attack. Because it is fundamental anthropology. So we're trying to get rid of that distinction. We're trying to deny it's a real distinction. And if you don't see the demonic in that, I don't know what to tell you. You see, but that's this idea. So this is nature, is that this notion that we have, that the distinction of mankind in two sexes, you have that as this basic fundamental aspect of the creation order. So people have a natural sense from the fact that God created from jump male and female. We have a natural sense that gender bending, that confusing or masking sexual differentiation is wrong. You see, now I don't know about you, but you see that. When you see a guy dressed up like a woman dressed up like a man. Now, I know our society tells you for you to feel that it's being a bigot. Okay? I say no. What it's feeling is recognizing the natural distinction that God created of men and women, and you're trying to blur that distinction, and it's weird. You see, you're trying to blur that. That's what I'm feeling. Is you rebelling against the creation order. And so that's what Paul is talking about, that natural sense. Now, given that sense of sexual distinction that is rooted in creation, the Corinthians, they would agree that if a man wore long hair, it dishonored him, but that if a woman wore long hair, it honored and exalted her. And they would agree with that because long hair had been culturally assigned as a kind of female covering. It was therefore inappropriate on a man in that cultural context. So we have distinctive creation, male and female, and then we have cultures that say this is distinctively female, this is distinctively male, and when you cross those two, okay, the people will recognize that that's inappropriate. That is a man appearing as a woman and a woman appearing as a man. And that's not right. Now, Paul is well aware, right? Paul's well aware that male hair has the same capacity to grow long as female hair. And he knows from Scripture, right, that the Nazarites, they were forbidden from cutting their hair. So he's certainly not saying, right, that long hair is universally or transculturally contrary to sex distinctions. Right? You can't simply say that in every culture, in every place, every time that a man having long hair would, but you can in specific cultures. And he's speaking into that culture, and they would agree with him, which is why he's using it. David Garland, in his commentary, says, long hair for men is unnatural for Paul because in his cultural context, it conveys sexual ambiguity and hints of moral perversion. It conveys that the guy's being like a woman. That's what it conveys. Bruce Winter, in his book, he says, the adult male inhabitants of Roman Corinth did not wear their hair long, for to do so indicated their denial of their masculinity. They were parading as homosexuals. Okay, so this is something that, so Paul knows that they're going to be on board with this. He's using this as an analogy. And Fortson and Graham's in a quote I gave you before, says about this text, he says, Paul is saying there is a natural distinction between men and women. If a man crosses this barrier and dons the appearance of a woman by growing his hair long, he is degrading himself. Paul's point is not that long hair is impossible for a man to grow, but that an effeminate appearance for a man is unnatural. It is contrary to the truth that God created male and female. It's unnatural. 1 Corinthians 11, 2-16, Paul is saying that men should be men and women should be women according to nature. While hairstyles are a matter of custom, in Paul's day, long hair on men suggested effeminacy in Greek and Roman culture. For a man to have long hair then was like cross-dressing, purposefully appearing contrary to his nature. Okay, so Paul is using this, what they understood and would accept. He's using it as an analogy for his argument, and his point is that the head covering that they've been asking him about, this piece of female attire, his point is that head covering in question, it functions analogously to long hair. Okay, it functions that way. It too was a culturally assigned, it was assigned as a culturally assigned as a female covering, and therefore it too is inappropriate on a man. It would be just like if the man grew long hair. But then he ends by saying, look, regardless of whether someone want to argue about it, they want to argue the point, he says that neither his group nor other churches of God engage in the practice of women praying uncovered. That is not part of what it means for the age to already have dawned. That is not part of what it means to be part of the inaugurated kingdom, that you discard cultural distinctions of gender. That's not part of it, despite what some people apparently were saying. Now, as I have explained, Paul in chapter 11, verses 2-16, he was addressing that problem of women who were speaking or claiming a right to speak in the worship assembly without the culturally required female head covering. And by indicating the speech would be acceptable if the woman wore the covering, right? We say, is it proper for her to pray without the covering? He said, no, she got to have the covering. So in saying that, he's implying that it's acceptable. It is right and proper for her to pray as long as she has the covering. He implicitly approves that form of female speech in the assembly. Now, though many assume that the speech in question was both praying and prophesying, Paul doesn't say that. I know he mentions praying or prophesying. I'll talk about that in a second. But when he comes down to it, when he summarizes the issue at hand, what he's being asked about, he says here in 11:13, he identifies by rhetorical question that specific issue. And he says, judge among yourselves, is it proper that a woman pray to God uncovered? Okay, pray. Prophesying's not mentioned. Now I know you people say, well, yeah, he doesn't mention it, but he means it. Okay, I can see that. I can hear you say that. But I'm thinking, no, he doesn't. I'm thinking he says praying specifically without prophesying because the specific issue was women who prayed in the assembly and wanted to do so without the covering. Okay? Now, as we will see in chapter 14, verses 33 through 36, Paul there reminds the Corinthians, in my judgment, and I will explain, and I do know that the text is disputed. People have different understandings of it. What do? I give you my understanding and explain why. Okay, then you do with it what you want. But when we get to 1 Corinthians 14, 33 to 36, there Paul, as I see it, he reminds the Corinthians that in all the churches that women are prohibited from participating in the prophetic process. That they're prohibited from participating in the prophetic process. So that's how I see those texts there. And that's consistent, you see, with the prohibition on women teaching the prohibition on them teaching in the assembly in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 14. Okay, so what I'm saying to you is that the women are praying in the assembly. Many people say that Paul here's the question about that he's dealing with both the women praying and prophesying in the assembly. And what I'm saying to you, they weren't prophesying in the assembly. We'll see that clearly in 1 Corinthians chapter 14. And they didn't prophesy in the assembly for the same reason they don't teach in the assembly, pursuant to 1 Timothy chapter 2, 11 to 14, because that would be an inappropriate exercise of authority over the men there. That would be getting them told, that would be directing them by presenting the Word of God to them. Okay, so that's why that's different from praying, because as I said weeks ago, praying is non-instructive. Now you may wonder why God would silence the women prophets in the assembly when prophesying edifies the community. I mean, that's a good question. Prophesying edifies the community, so why in the world would he ask the women prophets not to speak in the assembly? And it is apparently more important to God that his sovereign right to bestow leadership responsibility on men, that be acknowledged and honored in the assembly in the manner he has specified. So he has placed the leadership there and said, here is how I want you to acknowledge my sovereign right to place the leadership. I want you to do it this way. And so that is apparently more important to him. Women may exercise, they may exercise their prophetic gift in other contexts. So the community would not be deprived of their revelations, but in the churches, meaning in the congregational assemblies, they are called to honor God by manifesting publicly through their refraining from prophesying and teaching in the assembly. They're to manifest that publicly, that their acceptance then of God's right to choose men as the leaders. Okay? That's what I think is happening. That's the larger picture. It's part of the gathered community's testimony of submission to God. That we all as a body, this is how we are, this is how we function. We are all under you and seeking to do your will in our gathering. Now, this assembly-related restriction, in my view, this assembly-related restriction on female prophesying, it was recognized in the early church. Okay, this idea that somehow the women were restricted from prophesying in the assembly, that was recognized here. After surveying the relevant evidence from Tertullian, Firmilian, Origen, Chrysostom, and Gregory of Nazianzus, the renowned church historian Everett Ferguson says, from the standpoint of history, the evidence of Christian writings of the 2nd to 4th centuries is in continuity with the New Testament. Women were not appointed as elders, nor did they take public speaking roles in the assembly as prophets, teachers, or leaders in the assembly. Where women did take these roles in heretical and schismatic groups, the practice was a basis for objection to those groups. So Ferguson, who's, he was the editor of the Encyclopedia of Early Christianity and other things, this is his study of the subject. Now, the alleged female prophets, there was a group called the Montanists, also known as the Phrygian heresy. They arose in the 3rd quarter of the 2nd century, so after 150. They arose there, and they justified their activities of women prophesying, they said, in the assembly by saying, look, you have female prophets in the Bible, which of course you do. But they justified doing it in the assembly by appointing to those. But the orthodox or the mainstream writers of the church, the mainstream theologians, they challenged their claims by making a distinction between prophetesses, I'm quoting Ferguson here, between prophetesses delivering the word of the Lord in church and doing so in other circumstances. They distinguished prophecy and other speaking roles in the assembly from those outside the assembly. And that's what I'm suggesting to you is going on. I think the women in the early church, they prayed in the assembly. They did not prophesy in the assembly. I think that's clear from chapter 14, and I will explain how I see it that way. And I think that's clear. So they didn't teach or they didn't prophesy because that would be directing men. That would be getting them told. Directing them that way, and that would therefore be inconsistent with the submission that God calls the women to manifest in that gathering. Praying is different. It is non-directive, it is non-didactic. Now, Tertullian, at the beginning of the 3rd century, so early 200s, Tertullian, he told about a Montanist, a female prophet of the Montanist group, who received ecstatic visions, he says, during the sacred rites of the Lord's Day in the church. But he explains that she, this female prophetess, reported them only, quote, after the people are dismissed at the conclusion of the sacred services. So what I'm saying to you is this distinction I'm suggesting to you, that prophesying was improper, just like teaching was improper by women in the assembly. I'm not the first person to see that. Okay? You have somebody's picked that up because you see it being reflected here in the early church. Origen, he was a Greek-speaking Christian theologian and Bible scholar. He lived from about 185 to 254. And he illustrates this approach that I'm telling you in his commentary on 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35. And Origen says, if the daughters of Philip prophesied, they did not speak in church. For we do not find this in the Acts of the Apostles. Neither did the Old Covenant. Deborah, Miriam, and Huldah did not speak in the assembly. Anna did not speak in church. Therefore, the prophetic sign might be given for a woman to be a prophetess, but it is not permitted to her to speak in church. Now, that's what I think is going on. Now, given that the immediate problem Paul was addressing was women seeking to pray in the assembly, the question, of course, is why then in 11:5 does Paul say every woman who prays or prophesies? Right? I mean, that's where everybody goes, and they say, you see, so obviously both of these events, he says everyone who prays or prophesies uncovered, and they're both taking place in the assembly, so they contend. And so therefore, Paul implicitly approves the woman prophesying in the assembly just as much as he approves her praying in the assembly. I think that's a mistake. And I think it's a mistake that has bad consequences when you get to chapter 14, because this is what people do. They then say, I've already settled that Paul has accepted women prophesying in the assembly, so I know it can't mean that in 14. So then we go all over the place and miss what I think is the quite plain meaning, that women were not to participate in the prophetic process. But they can't take that meaning because they've already ruled it out over here, and I think they've ruled it out mistakenly. Okay, I think they've ruled it out mistakenly. I think Paul mentions women prophesying despite the fact that the fact that speech was permitted only outside the assembly by women. Okay, I think he mentions prophesying despite the fact they only prophesied outside the assembly, because the argument that was being made by the women or their advocates to justify praying in the assembly uncovered, that same argument would also justify prophesying outside the assembly uncovered. I think this is what's going on. That is, if the right of Christian women to engage in the traditionally male activity of public speech justifies their doing so as men, meaning without the culture's distinctive mark of femaleness, without the head covering, which I suggested to you was the argument being asserted, the rationale for casting it off, well, then it would justify doing so whether that public speech was in or out of the assembly. Right? If Paul says, yes, that's right, what you're saying is right, well, then any ruling that he makes on the actual issue, women praying in the assembly uncovering, would by logic also be a ruling on the non-assembly situation of prophesying. So for this purpose, Paul just mentions the two of them together. That's why I put so much stock on 13, where he actually states the issue is women praying. Okay, I don't think they're prophesying that. Now, my contention is that the Corinthians would have known, okay, that they would have known that both activities did not take place in the assembly. Okay, that's my contention. And I think that's reasonable. Okay, you say, well, you're putting a lot of stock in it. You're saying that they already would have known that they only prophesied outside the assembly, could pray and prophesy outside, but only pray in the assembly. And I think that's reasonable to think that, because Paul clearly had passed on to the Corinthians. He had passed on to them teaching about women speaking in worship, because he praises them in chapter 11, verse 2, for having held to that teaching when resisting the practice of women praying uncovered. So he'd already said something to them about women speaking in worship in the assembly. And I think, having done that he would also have made clear to them that prophesying takes place only outside the assembly. And as you see in 14, I think that because that prohibition, it was universal. The prohibition of women participating in the prophetic process in the assembly, that this was something that was universal and something that applied in all the churches. So I'm just thinking it seems reasonable to me to think that Paul, I know he has passed on instructions to them previously dealing with women speaking in worship, because they use those instructions to resist the current practice, the practice about which they're asking Paul. So given that there's a uniform, universal rule in all the churches that women do not prophesy in those churches, it makes sense to me that that was included in the things he passed on to them. I don't think that's crazy. Okay? I think it's quite reasonable. And then you see if that's right, and I think it is. Now I'm free to actually listen to 1 Corinthians 14. I don't come to it with this idea it can't mean that, even though you're looking at it saying, well, it sure looks like he's regulating the women's participation in the prophetic process. I mean, it certainly looks like that. Nah, it doesn't mean that. Can't mean that. We already know he dealt with that. Okay? So this is how I'm good. That's my contention there. That's how I see it. And so I complete verses 2 to 16. It's been weeks, but you have my thinking on it. As I say, I say this, if you hear it and understand it, then you do with it what you will. Okay? I tried to tell you how I see it, why I see it that way, and I hope I communicate that. That's my burden as the teacher, is to explain how I see it and why. And then when I do that, I hope that if it's true, it'll resonate. And if you think it's crazy, well, then you'll say, oh, I'm going to keep looking. Okay? Now, just understand, we sometimes take 1 Corinthians 11, and we deal with it and say, well, it says here something about men with head coverings. The guy wear a ball cap in this church, and you say, well, you're violating 1 Corinthians. Whatever you want to say about somebody wearing a ball cap in church, just don't point to 1 Corinthians 11. Right? Because it's not dealing with that. And we'll sometimes say, well, women, you have to wear this head covering. In our culture, right? Do you understand that this was a different world and culture, and the rationale for them wearing it there isn't something here? So it's just, to me, it's just misusing it. And it's misusing it because you haven't really, dug through it and understood it correctly. All right, 17 to 22. But in giving this instruction, I do not praise you. Remember, he praised them before for how they'd held to his tradition that he'd passed on to them with regard to the woman's question. He said, but in giving this instruction, I do not praise you, because you gather together not for the better, but for the worse. For in the first place, when you gather together as a church, I hear that divisions exist among you, and in part I believe it. For you say, now that's my bracket, okay? That's not in the text. That's me indicating to you that I think it's something the Corinthians said, okay? For you say, it is indeed necessary for factions to be among you, in order that also the approved ones may become apparent among you. Therefore, when you gather together in the same place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper, for each one consumes his own supper when eating. And so one is hungry, but another is drunk. For it certainly cannot be that you do not have houses to eat and drink in, can it? Or do you have contempt for the church of God, and so humiliate those who do not have? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this matter, I do not praise you. So Paul had praise for the way the leaders had handled that matter about the women praying uncovered. But he had no praise for the way that they assembled to eat the Lord's Supper. He'd heard that when they came together, there were divisions among them. And he's not referring to horizontal divisions. He'd heard there were divisions among them. He's not referring to horizontal divisions where understood equals, right? Where understood equals divide over different practices and beliefs. You see, so here we are all on the same plane, and our disagreements are like this. He's not referring to that, but he's referring to vertical divisions where the body of Christ is being stratified by social rankings. You see, there's a difference. Divisions this way between equals, and stratification of the body of Christ based on social rankings. He's referring to socioeconomic or class segregation in the assembly. That's what's got Paul, that's what's been told to him. Now, Paul says he believes the report in part, meaning he believes it to some extent, probably meaning that though he takes the report as credible, he assumes that not all the members of higher social rank were acting that way. Okay, to some extent, in part I believe it. It's a diplomatic way of giving some of them the benefit of the doubt. So he says, I hear that there are divisions among you, and I believe that to some extent. And in verse 19, this is just notoriously difficult. Okay, notoriously difficult. But I think Paul is saying that he readily gives credence to what he heard about the segregation at their gatherings, because, why does he so readily give credence to that? He gives credence to that because he's aware that at least some in Corinth were claiming that such factions were necessary in order that the approved ones, the higher status people, that those people, that the higher status people that they presumed were the tried and true of God, that they might stand out in the gathering. See, so they're saying, no, that this kind of division stuff is necessary so that we who are really, the special people of God might be seen and known. Anthony Thistleton in his commentary says, "For dissensions are unavoidable, it is claimed among you, in order that those who are tried and true among you may be visibly revealed." Now, there are other commentators like David Garland and Champ and Rossner. They agree that Paul is referring to a Corinthian sentiment, but they think Paul's doing so instead of just giving the reason why he so readily accepts this report that there's division among them, that Paul has this sense of irony or sarcasm. That he's really, of course, it's hard to pull these kinds of things off a page, right? But that kind of resonates with how I see Paul and think, is that he's delivering this, he's mentioning this claim that they have circulating with a rebuking tone, rather than just merely noting it as the rationale for his acceptance of that report. And I think that's what he's doing. Now, I think that makes better sense, but it's important, both of those views, okay, both of them accept the notion that this is a Corinthian sentiment. So when I put that in brackets, I say, yes, that's not in the text and it's being read in there, but I think it's right. I think that's probably the way it should be there. Now, Champ and Rossner, they say, but in giving this instruction, I'm sorry, I should have hit that earlier. Here's what Champ and Rossner say. Paul most likely is referring to a view that was reported to him as being held by some Corinthians. They thought the differences among them were a reflection of those who had God's special approval. The following verses make it clear, however, that the divisions were provoked by the insensitive behavior of some of the social elites within the Corinthian church, and that behavior most certainly did not meet with God's approval. If anyone could be said to have God's approval in the Corinthian church, it would not be any of those wealthier and more socially advanced Christians who were snubbing their brothers and sisters. You see, but you see how this would work, and I think that's what's going on in that he says, some of you are saying this, and so I readily accept this because I've heard that you guys got this idea among you that we need to do this so we'll stand out because we are God's tried and true. And I can see human beings doing that. Now, if on the other hand, if you say, well, no, I'm not buying that, you can't just throw stuff in there. Some of this stuff is like I said, there's an art to this, and you're trying to get a sense for what do I think's going on. If you say, no, I don't like that, I'm not going to say that it's Paul, or that's a Corinthian sentiment. Just let me finish this. If you say, well, it's Paul saying that, well, then it seems Paul is saying that factions were necessary in Corinth in order that the true believers, the genuine believers, might be set apart or distinguished from the frauds, the imitators, the faux Christians. And so that when you have a mixed group like that, well, then of course factions are going to be necessary, because that would be necessary to identify the true versus the other. Okay, I don't think that's the right answer, but if you don't like imputing that to the Corinthians, well, then you may go that route, okay? All right, a lot of stuff, talking fast, but thanks for hanging in. Thank you, bro. And I forgot the D. I'm doing this. Can I talk to you later? Okay. I know the bell's going to ring. I got 7 minutes, so we'll see how far we can get. Let me have a hit of water here as we tee up the Lord's Supper.